Hi, everyone. Ted Wyman here with another edition of Jet Setting. And today it's a fairly momentous day in Winnipeg Jets 2.0 history as the Winnipeg Jets have bought out former captain Blake Wheeler, a player who has meant an awful lot to the organization since they arrived from Atlanta. He came with the team, and he's been a huge part of the organization ever since. But today he is no longer a Winnipeg Jet, and I want to get your guys' reaction right away. Paul Friesen, what are your thoughts on this decision by the Jets? Is it something that just had to be done?
Oh yeah. I think everybody realized it had to be done. Not just financially, but it was probably time to move on after his season-ending comments. Taking the captaincy away was kind of step one, and this had to be the obvious next step. So that's how I see it: is not just a hockey move, a financial move, hockey move, and even a dressing room culture move.
Yeah, a move that had to be made in that sense, I think, because we heard at the end of the season that even though he was stripped of his captaincy, he was still the captain to a lot of players in that room, and his influence was still very high. And I think a lot of us would agree, and Scott, I'll throw to you right now, that that influence maybe was hindering the Jets going forward. We don't want to tarnish Blake Wheeler's legacy because he obviously did a lot for the Winnipeg Jets, but that, there was that issue as well that they needed to move on from. And that's just how that locker room worked around him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question. I think the team knew it. I think the fact that the team bought out Blake Wheeler speaks volumes today, right? I mean, I think you could easily have seen a picture where where the Jets would have just hung on to Wheeler for his final year, given him the farewell tour, because this is the contract that they agreed to, and the Jets don't often move on from those contracts. They like to they like to honor the contracts that they sign. It's part of their way that they can. It's one tool that they have to try and let's say coerce players to sign here, and we know it's difficult. But yeah, I mean, I think that what you saw today, or Friday, June 30th, the deadline to buy out players this season, that they went through with it, and I think that speaks a lot to where this team is at, where the direction it's going. Yes, I think for this team to the younger core, let's say the younger leadership core of this team, to spread its wings, Blake Wheeler needed to be removed from the situation. But like you said, Ted, and I think we should spend some time talking about this. I don't, as Blake Wheeler had his flaws, of course, especially as a captain. But for bang for your buck, for all that stuff, I mean, I don't know any games that I'd look back at and say that Blake Wheeler took a night off, let alone, not even a shift off. Here's a guy who drove his sternum into an open door in Dallas in 2014 and only missed a few shifts. Came back this year, ruptured testicle. Played the game with a ruptured testicle. I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but there's a guy who gave his, one of his, yeah, you know what I'm saying, to this team
for the team.
And so, I mean, we as in the media, we've had our thorny side. I mean, Paul can certainly speak to that, the thorny side of Blake Wheeler. But I think for the fans today, they're losing a lot. They're losing a guy who kind of embodied what they would want out of a player. Here's a guy who re-signed during the peak of his career. Coming off his first 91-point season, he could have gone anywhere as an unrestricted free agent. He thought he could win in Winnipeg. That gave this team some credibility in the free agent market, because they could have. Wheeler could easily gone somewhere else, and he chose to stay here. At that time, he was one of the elite passers in the game. 91 points was massive. He did that back-to-back years. I think for fans, there's a lot of good to look back on, and they will over 12 years. Blake Wheeler was the only remaining player that came over from Atlanta. He's one of three that still remains in this league. Blake Wheeler gave his whole entire career essentially to the Winnipeg Jets, and I don't think that can be forgotten today either. Even if there are good reasons why he was bought out today. But at the end of the day, I think you kind of weigh with the good with the bad, and I think for a lot of people are going to look at and I think the legacy a Blake Wheeler here, or let's say next season when he returns here, it's going to be a raucous ovation for him, because I think a lot of people appreciate the work ethic and what he gave to this club on and off the ice.
Paul, what about you? What do you think his legacy will be, given pretty much what Scott all just said and what you've seen over all these years of him being part of the Jets organization?
He did a lot on and off the ice, let's face it. And Scott well said that wrapped it up very nicely. What I'm going to remember most is what we deal in as words. And he was one of the best. He gave some of the best interviews in these last 12 years of anyone I can remember. He took on Donald Trump on Twitter, not once, but twice. The first issue was about the NFL players taking a knee for the anthem. Trump called them SOBs and said they should be fired. And Wheeler pointed out, it's the First Amendment, Mr. President, the first one. And he took Trump on again with the gun control laws after a school shooting in Florida. He got vocal about social justice after the George Floyd murder. He said, my city is burning. America is not okay. And then he gave extensive interviews about those things later. And he talked about that school shooting. He talked about having his kids in a Canadian school and how NHL players were starting to give that some consideration, given the lack of gun control down south. So that's the kind of stuff I'm going to remember about him the most. Is you could count on him to tell you what's on his mind for the most part. There were times he got prickly with us, sure. And maybe the most famous one after the 2019 playoff exit, when he told me to F off. So I didn't hold that against him. And to this day, I'm glad that's the kind of outspoken guy he was.
Well, let's face it, a lot of people want to say that to you, Paul, but including even me and Scott sometimes. So
just to chime in here, and to go along with what Fraser said, I think that is if nothing else, I think Blake Wheeler was quite honest with a lot of us at times, right? I mean, even if it was blunt at times, like it was with Paul, but the one thing I always remember about Blake Wheeler, at least in my mind, was that here's a guy who was probably more thorny after a win than he was after a loss. It was almost like he never wanted the highs to get too high and he never wanted the lows to get too low. So he was almost more complimentary after a loss and that sort of thing, and more critical after a win. And he was honest. I mean, even after the 2017-18 season, I believe the quote was, we haven't won, SHIT, right? And we haven't done anything, right? And I think because, they got to the Western Conference final, but that's only really halfway to the Stanley Cup. And so all the buzz around this team heading into the 2018-19 year was that this team was on the cusp of winning a Stanley Cup. But Blake Wheeler made it known before the start of that season that, the Jets haven't really done anything yet. And I thought that was one of the many quotes that he had over the years, where he always kept it, kind of level and maybe real, is, I don't know if that's the right word or not, but he was very good at, in my opinion, at trying to temper, I guess, expectations just based on what he knew from his, extensive time in the league. So, but yeah, I mean, to Paul's point, he was one of the best quotes. I mean, you never knew what was going to come out of his mouth, but I think on and off the ice, this was a guy that embodied what you would want, I think, as a captain, even if he wasn't, like I said earlier, he had his flaws for sure. But you can understand, this guy was, he championed more than just the Winnipeg Jets, other causes, the things like, Fraser said. So, yeah.
I'm going to disagree with you guys on this one, though. I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, because I'm not going to say that he embodied what you want in a captain. I think he showed by example very well. I think he was a leader in terms of leading in practice and being the hardest working guy. But I'm not convinced from a lot of things that we've heard that he was particularly good at mentoring younger players, at dealing with younger players, and being that kind of a leader of men in the room. And I know from, you and I, Scott and Paul, we've dealt with a lot of leaders over the years. We've dealt with a lot of captains in the NHL, and there's a lot of guys, I can think of, you're being lofty when you compare it to Sidney Crosby and Steven Stamkos, but these are guys that always are engaging. And now maybe you don't like being in front of the media, but the media are portraying what you're saying out to the rest of the public. So the way you deal with the media is what ends up coming out. And I think Blake Wheeler's inability to deal with the media in a courteous fashion many times was, I think, not a great leadership quality. And I think it showed a lot of other players in that room that it was okay to deal with people that way as well. So I personally just didn't love that about him. And the idea that he had a lot of great quotes over the year, that is true, but he also had a lot of very terse moments where he didn't give up anything and he wasn't willing to. So, you know, I don't want to portray that I'm saying, you know, don't let the door hit you on the way out to Blake Wheeler, because I do think he did do a lot for this team. I think without him, who knows where the Jets would have been. He was a core guy that signed long-term and gave a lot for this team. But it is interesting that when it comes right down to it, he's not really being bought out because he makes too much money and he's not productive enough. He's being bought out because they need to move on from him and get him out of that room.
Fair enough. So you're not saying F on Blake.
No, I'm definitely not saying that. And Paul, you know, you always held your tongue very nicely on that one. Never took offense to that. A lot of people, you know, found that very interesting. But that was, you know, you like that honesty, right? You like it that he let you know what he was thinking in that moment and not just be boring, right?
Yeah, well, you don't want a cliche answer. You don't treat people that way, though. I mean, let's face it. That's not how you answer a question. And it was an innocuous, open-ended question, which months later he admitted they didn't come up with their best game, which is what I'd asked about. You know, so given some time to cool off, he clearly realized that I wasn't wrong in suggesting they hadn't come up with their best game against St. Louis that day. But I hear what you're saying. I don't know that it matters to in a leadership way so much as you're suggesting, Ted, how he deals with media. That's more of an organizational, maybe reflection of the organization. I don't know that I mean, you want your captain to treat everybody with respect, but I don't know if that was his big leadership flaw with the Jets. I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know how that was seen in the room.
Yeah, you know, hey, it's a good discussion. There's no doubt about it. Scott, it's been a really interesting week for the Winnipeg Jets, without question. They move on from Pierre-Luc Dubois. I think it's a pretty good trade. I think a lot of people would say they got a pretty nice return. We'll have to wait and see exactly how good these players are that come back. But, you know, when I walk out on the street and people stop me, they're pretty excited about what Chevy was able to pull out of his new you-know-where to get some players in here for Pierre-Luc Dubois. And Paul, I know what you wrote, which is that it's, you know, it doesn't look great on this organization that guys have moved on. So I'd like you both to just speak to that trade and give us an idea of what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I can go first on that. Yeah, I'll go first. First of all, I mean, okay, let's say in a vacuum, the trade was great. I mean, I think you have to look at the fact that, you know, they turned one player into three, you know, potentially, you know, essentially four, because they'll get a draft pick out of the deal and that sort of thing. So I think it's important in a vacuum that they maximize their return based on the parameters of what they could work with. The fact that Dubois would basically only sign with a handful of teams, if that, and then you needed one of those or two of those teams within that handful to actually make the trade happen. So, you know, it's I agree with Paul. Like, I mean, you know, it's too many times this team has been backed into a corner like this, where they're forced to you know, like you said, Ted, to pull something out of his behind. You know, Kevin Cheveldayoff has become reasonably good at doing that when his back is up against the wall, but you know, it's not something you want to be known for, and especially in this town. And with how difficult it is to, you know, just retain players. But you know, you look at the trade and you know, when Kevin Cheveldayoff came on and said that they added dimension and depth to their team, I agree with him. They did. I mean, they added a top six winger who can play center. They added a middle six guy, a winger with leadership, 420 games under his NHL belt. I mean, he's a veteran. And then a bit of a reclamation project in Erasmus Kapari, who the Jets, you know, I think would have rather had drafted than maybe some of the other guys that they had, but hasn't panned out in LA. So, I mean, there's risk on both sides. Two of these guys, both Kapari and Velarde, are restricted free agents. Velarde seems, you know, whether or not he wanted to get traded to Winnipeg. Seems like he's in for it. There's going to be opportunity for these guys too, right? I mean, it showed a bit of a shift in this organization to youth, right? Velarde's 23, Kapari, I believe, is the same age. Iafallo is 28 or 29. But that's two young players, and one of the things Kevin Cheveldayoff said at the draft, which we'll get into, is that they're going to give Cole Perfetti a shot at center. So it looks like this team finally, because they've talked a lot over the years about drafting and developing, but there's been times, and we can point to a guy like Ville Heinola right now who still hasn't really gotten his chance, and he was a first round draft pick. But this team eventually has to start giving opportunities to its younger players sooner, because I think part of the reason why, and if we can go right back to the Jacob Trouba trade request in 2016. The first thing in that line from his thing was they wanted him to realize his potential. We can argue about whether Jacob Trouba was ever going to stay here or not. But the first thing that he talked about when that was his opportunity to play on the right side, because that right side at that time was taken up by Dustin Byfuglien. And so, I think one of the things that Jets have to do in this organization going forward is, if you're going to draft and develop, and that's going to be your philosophy and the driving factor, but trying to find success, then you have to actually give that opportunity to the guys that you draft and develop. And a couple of things that Kevin Cheveldayoff said at the draft kind of piqued my interest, because it seems like they're finally starting to get that 12 years into this, where it's not just, okay, well, we'll put our best players in, but sometimes you got to put your second best players in and see if they can actually make something of it too, and not just have them marinate and team control and contract sliding all the time and that sort of thing. Sometimes you got to give guys a chance before, eventually they just don't want to be here anymore. And, I think that's kind of where they're going with, getting some young players out of this Dubois trade and things like that. So I know, long-winded answer, but I think it's warranted, because this is it's been a week, right? Like, I mean, it was Tuesday when they traded Dubois. It's Friday now, but it feels like a number of things. It feels like a world away since when they traded Dubois now. And so it's been a monumental week for this team, and they're forced to do it. But the fact that they're actually doing it, right? Like, I think, to me, shows that this team is finally on board with what I think a lot of people have seen for the last 2 or 3 years that they've needed to do. They're finally there, starting to do it. Paul?
All right, Paul. So you did have a bit of a different take at first. Did he change your mind at all?
No, pure hockey wise, given that Dubois forced their hand, Cheveldayoff made a great deal. But why did Dubois have to force their hand? To me, when your top players want to leave, that reflects poorly on the organization.
100%.
Like Patrick Laine before him, Pierre-Luc Dubois now, apparently Connor Hellebuyck, right?
Oh.
Yeah. So, well, those were other circumstances, but so that's never a good reflection. If this was a Stanley Cup contending team that had just lost in the conference final again, Pierre-Luc Dubois and Connor Hellebuyck might be gung-ho to sign long-term here. And that's what you should have built by now after 12 years in Winnipeg. Yeah. That's what should be built by now. So that's where I see the big flaw. Time, of course, will always tell the winner of a trade. This might turn out to be a very good trade for the Jets if Vilardi becomes what it appears he could become. Iafallo is kind of the almost, we don't talk about him enough. He's a pretty solid player already.
Yep.
And then a bonus on what the young Finn might do. But if Dubois becomes a franchise center that we think he will, and the other guys don't, if the other guys don't become what they think they can be, it's not a good trade. So time always gives us the answer on that. But again, I just keep coming back to, why does he want out, right? And it wasn't just to go home to Montreal, obviously.
And speaking about that, time will always tell how Winnipeg Jets prospects do down the road. Scott, can you just quickly give us a summation of the draft and what you saw there and what the Jets picked up? There's a lot of excitement around their first pick, Colby Barlow.
Yeah, I mean, and there should be, because one of the things with Colby Barlow is that, I mean, he was in depending on whose draft board you look at, was a top 10 pick. And, because of how good this draft was this year, People calling it, a first round and a half, right? Because, there's just so many good picks even into the second round. Barlow could have gone in the top 10, and there's a lot of players that went outside of the top 10 that probably could have still gone in the top 10 that didn't. But everything you've heard about Coley Barlow, he's exactly what the Jets like, right? Like it's off ice. It's a Scholastic Player of the Year. They love that. Josh Morrissey, Cole Perfetti, Adam Lowry. Trying to think of the other ones right now, but I can't. But there's been a lot of them that have gone on to this team, and I think it's important that they get guys that Colby Barlow is the youngest captain in Owen Sound attack history at 17 years of age. I talked to both the GM and the head coach last year, and they weren't on the same page when they made that decision. But it paid off. And here's a guy who scored an incredible rate in the OHL. 76 goals in 118 games is pretty good. 46 of those coming last year in just his second year as a 17-year-old in the O. So there's a talent that goes along with the smarts there. But he had 20-year-olds there saying that they wanted a 17-year-old to be a captain. And here's the thing, like if you think about some of these Scholastic players that have come through here, and it doesn't mean much in the end. Yeah, the kid was pretty good at school. But if you look at the Scholastic players that have won and the ones that are on the Jets, they're the ones that are still with the Jets, right? Like the Morrisseys, the Adam Lowrys. Those ones have been the longest in terms of when they were drafted. But it's character, right? And one of the things I wrote on the draft after the first round was the Jets often see character and talent as shoulder to shoulder in terms of how they draft, and they got both with Barlow. And then in their third round pick, they got a guy, Zachary Nearing. He's not a Manitoban, but he might as well be. He's got his mom's from here. Wow, one set of his grandparents still reside here. He once played for the Winnipeg Junior Jets in the Brick Invitational Tournament way back when. So here's the guy who said, all these kids say that they always wanted to go to the team they got drafted by, right? But Zachary Nearing has this kind of, when he says it sounds genuine, because here's a guy who has family here and roots here, and his dad's from Minot, which is 4.5 hours south of here. So it's not it's a close by. The kid's going to be going to college and that sort of thing, but it sounds like he wants to be here, and he's a big forward. And that's the Jets went forward heavy. They drafted, out of their 5 picks, they drafted 4 forwards, 3 wingers, 1 center. And then Thomas Milic, a goaltender who, if you're a Winnipeg Ice fan, you didn't like him because he absolutely stonewalled the ice in the WHL final. He also backstopped Team Canada to a gold medal at the World Juniors. Will he turn into the next Connor Hellebuck? Both were 5th round picks. That remains to be seen. But they took, they took a chance on another goalie, and they have Dom DiVincentis, who they took last year in the 7th round, that they're high on, OHL goaltender of the year this past season. So the Jets are trying to rebuild that, because they're probably going to lose Connor Hellebuck this summer, and so they're going to need, they need this in the future. They need new guys coming up, and so they didn't have a lot of picks, but I think if you look at the draft as in a vacuum, like we always do with drafts, they picked good, and they got character guys, and that's what you want when the Jets are in these drafts. You want guys that want to be in Winnipeg. Or leaders and that sort of thing. That's always an important step for the Jets every year, is trying to find a player with skill, but also kind of that's wiser beyond his years. And I think they did that, especially with Barlow in the first round.
Right on. Thanks for that, for summing that all up, Scott. And folks, you can read all of Scott's draft coverage, all of the trade coverage, the Blake Wheeler buyout, all on winnipegsun.com. Paul Friesen has an excellent article up about a goaltender from Carberry who kind of got the whole town talking by getting drafted, and all that happening just after that horrible accident just outside the city in Carberry. That's a great piece, Paul. Guys, thanks so much for joining me today, and I'm sure there will be lots more to talk about. There's still Scheifele and Hellebuck maybe to come on the
free
trade
agency
front.
on
See
Saturday.
how it goes.
Yeah.
And free agency on Saturday. So for Paul Friesen and Scott Billeck, you've been watching Jet Setting on winnipegsun.com.